When dealing with a narcissist, the first and most crucial shift you can make is moving from an emotional state to an analytical state. This isn't just a psychological preference, it's a neurobiological transformation. Narcissists are experts at triggering your limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional reactions such as fear, anger, and anxiety. They provoke these responses because emotional reactivity places you in a vulnerable and manipulable state. When you're emotionally hijacked, your decision-making capacity is reduced, and your responses become predictable and easy to exploit. To counter this, you have to consciously engage your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in reasoning, executive function, and cognitive control. The moment you recognize you're being emotionally triggered, slow your breath and anchor your attention. Diaphragmatic breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, even for just 60 seconds, sends a signal to the brain that you're safe. This reduces amygdala activity and allows the prefrontal cortex to regain control. Now you're no longer reacting, you're observing. Once you're back in an analytical state, start analyzing the situation like an outsider would. Ask yourself, what is the actual objective of this conversation? What pattern is repeating here? What do they want me to feel right now? These types of questions interrupt emotional momentum and return agency to your cognition. You start to see that many of their tactics, gaslighting, love-bombing, blame, shifting, are patterned behaviors, not unique attacks. This realization alone can break the spell of their perceived authority. Another key point is language. Replace reactive language with observational language. Instead of saying, "You're making me feel crazy," say, "It's interesting that this conversation always seems to go in circles." Instead of defending yourself emotionally, pose a logical question or make a neutral observation. This subtle linguistic shift helps rewire your response pattern from emotional defense to cognitive stability. Over time, this retrains your nervous system to interpret their behavior not as threatening, but as data, information you can assess and respond to, not absorb or mirror. By operating from an analytical mindset, you not only protect yourself, but you begin to destabilize their control. Narcissists expect an emotional target. They are not equipped to deal with neutral, grounded, and rational resistance. They often become disoriented or even agitated when their usual triggers fail to land. This is where the leverage begins to build, because your lack of emotional reactivity signals a loss of influence to them. You are no longer a compliant node in their emotional network. You've become an unpredictable system, something they cannot easily manipulate or decode. One of the most powerful tools to disarm a narcissist is strategic silence. This isn't passive silence or avoidance, it's a deliberate, neurologically informed pause that creates a moment of cognitive delay. Narcissists rely heavily on rapid-fire interactions to provoke an emotional response. They throw accusations, shift blame, or deliver back-handed compliments with the intent to get you to react impulsively. The moment you react, they gain control of the emotional narrative. But when you introduce silence measured, intentional, and calm, you create a neurological disruption in their pattern of manipulation. From a brain science perspective, this works because silence gives your autonomic nervous system a chance to settle. In stressful exchanges, your sympathetic nervous system ramps up, heart rate increases, adrenaline surges, and cortisol rises. These changes narrow your cognitive bandwidth and push you toward fight or flight behavior. Silence acts as a circuit breaker. By pausing and resisting the urge to respond immediately, you activate your parasympathetic system, bringing you back to a state of composure and awareness. This self-regulation alone changes the power dynamic. Psychologically, narcissists are conditioned to expect certain patterns. They test your boundaries, and when you respond predictably, through defending yourself, justifying, or pleading, They lock in on that pattern and repeat it to maintain dominance. Silence is unexpected. When you don't immediately respond, they are forced to confront a vacuum. In that vacuum, their need for control escalates, but their tools, words, tone, projection, have nothing to latch onto. That moment of silence becomes deeply uncomfortable for them, but grounding for you. This tactic is especially effective during accusations or circular arguments. Rather than arguing or trying to make your point heard, simply pause, count 5 slow breaths, make eye contact without reacting. Let them fill the space. What often happens is they begin to show their own instability. They repeat themselves, contradict their previous statement, or escalate emotionally, all while you maintain a regulated, neutral posture. This posture communicates power without aggression. It's not passive, it's presence without participation in their manipulation. Strategic silence also trains your internal system to stop equating urgency with truth. Narcissists often operate on manufactured urgency. You need to answer me now. Or why aren't you saying anything? These are psychological traps. When you resist that urgency, when you let silence sit in the space between stimulus and response, you reclaim that space as your own. You move from being a participant in their drama to being the observer of their dysfunction. The illusion of a narcissist's power is one of their greatest weapons. They present themselves as confident, dominant, and emotionally untouchable, but beneath that carefully constructed exterior lies a fragile and fragmented self-concept. Understanding this not just intellectually, but somatically changes the entire dynamic. The shift begins when you stop interpreting their behavior as strength and start seeing it for what it really is: a defense mechanism designed to mask insecurity and a lack of true self-worth. From a neuroscience perspective, individuals with narcissistic traits often display dysregulated emotional processing, particularly in areas related to empathy and self-reflection. Studies have shown that their brain activity tends to be overactive in the default mode network, the system associated with self-referential thinking, and underactive in regions associated with emotional regulation and interpersonal empathy. What this means practically is that their grandiosity and aggression are compensations, not assets. Every time they belittle someone, manipulate a conversation, or assert dominance, they're reinforcing a very unstable internal narrative that says, if I'm not superior, I'm nothing. Reframing their power as fragility is a psychological tactic that helps you detach emotionally. When you stop viewing their manipulation as an attack and start seeing it as a desperate attempt to maintain control, the emotional charge decreases. Their words lose impact because you're no longer interpreting them as coming from a place of authority. You begin to recognize that their tactics, whether it's gaslighting, triangulation, or rage, are actually signs of internal panic, not mastery. This realization doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does neutralize the fear-based response they rely on to manipulate others. There's also a biological benefit to this mental reframe. When you perceive someone as threatening, your amygdala fires rapidly, flooding your body with stress hormones. But when you cognitively reinterpret that person as fragile or desperate, your limbic system relaxes. You're engaging the top-down processing of your prefrontal cortex, which regulates threat responses and promotes logical analysis. This allows you to stay composed in situations where you'd normally feel defensive or overwhelmed. Your body begins to reinforce the message that you are not under threat. You are in control of your interpretation. This reframe isn't about pity or moral superiority, it's about clarity. The more you observe their behavior through the lens of fragility, the less you feel compelled to defend yourself. You see through the performance, you recognize the cracks. Their inflated sense of self becomes transparent, and you stop reacting as if you're dealing with someone who has power over your sense of reality. Instead, you begin to see them as someone who is addicted to validation, allergic to vulnerability, and utterly dependent on external control to maintain their psychological equilibrium. Mirroring is a deeply ingrained human behavior rooted in the brain's mirror neuron system, which helps us empathize, learn, and socially connect. Narcissists exploit this natural mechanism by provoking emotional reactions that lead their targets to unconsciously mirror their energy, usually fear, defensiveness, or submission. The moment you mirror them emotionally, you're pulled into their psychological rhythm. But when you learn to mirror them consciously detached from emotional investment, you shift from being a reactive participant to a calculated observer. This strategy involves deliberate mimicry of their tone, body language, or language patterns without internalizing the emotional charge behind it. You match their energy not to validate it, but to neutralize its influence. Neuroscientifically, this keeps your limbic system in check while allowing your prefrontal cortex to remain engaged. It becomes a method of communication control rather than emotional entanglement. For instance, if a narcissist uses a sarcastic or belittling tone, you might reflect that same tone back briefly, not to escalate, but to create a cognitive disruption. It signals that their usual tactics won't produce the expected results. This psychological mirroring breaks their pattern recognition, something they rely on to stay in control. The key here is precision. You're not emotionally surrendering to the game, you're studying it and feeding it back through a filtered lens. This is what makes the behavior conscious. Your awareness becomes your shield. You might repeat their own words back to them in a neutral voice, or respond with similar phrasing but stripped of emotional content. This technique is unsettling for the narcissist because it denies them the validation they seek from emotional dominance. Instead of being pulled into a reactive dynamic, you become a reflective surface, unreadable, unshakable, and resistant to their attempts to shape your internal state. From a behavioral perspective, this is a method of psychological extinction. You're removing the reward from their manipulative behavior. Every time they escalate, bait, or attempt to dominate, and you reflect their style without giving them emotional engagement, the behavior loses its power. You're not feeding their need for control, you're exposing its futility. Over time, this mirroring technique teaches your nervous system how to stay present without fusing with their emotional energy. It becomes easier to remain grounded, even in the face of provocation, because you're responding from a place of intention, not instinct. This also builds a deeper form of internal discipline. You become aware of your own emotional triggers and learn to pause before reacting. The narcissist thrives on unconscious reactions, so when you use conscious mirroring, you introduce a level of self-awareness that they are incapable of matching. It's a form of resistance that doesn't rely on confrontation or withdrawal, but on mastery of presence and psychological calibration. Micro-boundaries are subtle, often nonverbal, shifts in behavior that interrupt the narcissist's control loop without alerting them to a confrontation. Unlike overt boundaries, which narcissists tend to challenge directly and aggressively, micro-boundaries operate beneath their radar. These are small intentional acts such as not answering a loaded question, redirecting a manipulative conversation, or disengaging from a toxic dynamic without explanation, that gradually dismantle the structure of their influence. What makes micro-boundaries so effective is that they train your nervous system to resist control in real time while depriving the narcissist of the reaction they crave. At a neurobiological level, each micro-boundary acts as a recalibration of your stress response. When you're under narcissistic pressure, your body often moves into a sympathetic state: tight chest, elevated heart rate, a compulsion to defend or explain. Micro-boundaries teach your body to decouple from that automatic reaction. For example, when a narcissist pushes you for an answer or tries to corner you emotionally, instead of justifying yourself, you might respond with a calm "that doesn't work for me," or even silence. These responses send a message to your nervous system: we're not engaging, we're not performing, we're in control. Psychologically, these boundaries work because they disrupt the narcissist's prediction model. Narcissists depend on predictability to manipulate: predictable guilt, predictable submission, predictable reactivity. Micro-boundaries confuse this model. They begin to notice that their tactics no longer yield the same results, but they can't immediately identify why. There's no dramatic moment for them to attack or spin. It's not about escalation, it's about erosion. Every time you set a micro-boundary, you erode a small piece of their perceived dominance. This technique also helps rebuild internal trust. One of the subtle damages of narcissistic relationships is the loss of trust in your own instincts. You start to second-guess your perceptions, your tone, your decisions. By making tiny but consistent choices that protect your energy, choosing when to engage, when to speak, when to exit, you slowly reestablish a sense of personal agency. It's not about seeking permission or offering justification. It's about silently asserting autonomy over your mental and emotional bandwidth. Micro-boundaries are not announcements. You're not declaring war or issuing ultimatums. You're simply making invisible decisions that reclaim space. You don't respond to a provocative text. You leave the room when the conversation turns abusive. You change the topic without asking. These are low-conflict, high-impact choices that accumulate psychological power over time. Because you're not telegraphing your resistance, the narcissist cannot immediately retaliate or adapt. They are left reacting to a changing environment they no longer fully understand, and that destabilization gradually weakens their grip on your behavior and sense of self. When you apply these 5 mind shifts, transitioning from emotional to analytical thinking using strategic silence, reframing narcissistic power as fragility, mirroring behavior consciously, and setting micro-boundaries, you fundamentally change the neuropsychological structure of the relationship. Each tactic is not just a surface-level technique, it's a recalibration of your internal system. You're no longer operating from a reactive state governed by survival responses. Instead, you're engaging with clarity, intention, and control. Narcissists rely on unconscious compliance, emotional volatility, and predictable patterns. The moment you begin interrupting those patterns, their power starts to dissolve, not because you challenge them directly, but because you denied them the psychological oxygen they require to dominate. What you're left with is not only distance from their control, but a deeper mastery of your own nervous system, your own choices, and ultimately your own peace.